Okay. And we are live and we're recording, and our room is filling up. So your fans and friends and family are here. So this is just wonderful. Hi everyone. If you are here for the fantastic launch of the brand new book, Trustworthy by Margot Bloomstein, I am here with our special guest of honor. And we will get started in a second, but I do want this room to fill up. So I just want to just do a little bit of chatting because I see art in the background of both of our guests. And so Margot, I'll start with you. What's on your wall behind you?
These are little watercolor sketches of a town that is sort of a few hours south of Paris. It's a little town in the Minervois wine region in France, which sounds spectacular. What's really spectacular about it is I have a friend that happened to live there and said, I have some space there if you want a sort of cheap vacation to be able to just get yourself there and you can stay there really cheap. And I was like, that's not a cheap vacation, but it sounds amazing. But at any rate, she said, go there, spend some time there. And it was an opportunity to live for a while in another country. And that was where I started exploring some of the themes in Trustworthy.
Wow.
Yeah. It was one of those, wow, is this really happening? Okay, this is an incredible opportunity and I will enjoy everything about it.
That is phenomenal. That is a great story. I love that so much. That's so great. Lylah, what is on your wall behind you?
So it's a collection of different things. I've got some posters from other events that I've done, but mostly I keep my children's artwork behind me because I figure I like to look at the things that make me happy. And my 16-year-old daughter is an artist. So there's some of her earlier stuff on this side and some of her more recent stuff on that side. And my son, not to be outdone, is he loves to illustrate and sketch. And so there are a few of his things around here as well. But it kind of keeps me grounded and reminds me why I do what I do. It's to make sure they can have what they have.
That is amazing. These are just, I love stories like this. This is the best. I am going to get us started just because this is going to be a jam-packed hour. My name is Kira Wilson-Cook. I am the events coordinator for the Silver Unicorn Bookstore in Acton, Massachusetts. I am so proud to be part of the special launch event of the brand new book, Trustworthy, by Margot Bloomstein. Congratulations. This is a beautiful book. Happy launch day. It's such a big deal to launch a book. I believe this is your Second. Yes. So you've done this once and now you've done it again. And that is it's just so phenomenal. We'll talk more in a second about this. So Margot is the principal of her own company, Appropriate Inc. And we are sharing the stage with journalist, editor, Lylah Alphonse, who is the editor of the Boston Globe, the Rhode Island section of the Boston Globe. It's just such an honor to have you here, to have you both here to be part of this launch event. I just want to say to our audience, which I know doesn't want to see any more of me, so I'm going to stop rambling in a second, that this beautiful book not only is available at the Silver Unicorn Bookstore if you're local or silverunicornbooks.com, but there are signed copies available. Margot came in earlier today to sign books. So if you want a signed copy and you're not local, you can order from silverunicornbooks.com and just put in the comment section, I would like a signed book, please. And we will make sure that we ship that out to you. For those of you who are here, you can participate by adding your questions to the Q&A. Lylah will be moderating this conversation and she will be checking the questions in the Q&A. So put them in at any time. And with that, I just have to say, just congratulations again and again. Happy launch day. What a really big day for you. And this is going to be really just so special and fabulous. So just thank you so much to the both of you for being with us here tonight.
Thank you so much.
To be here. Thank you.
Absolutely. All right, I'm disappearing.
Margot, why don't we start with a little bit about you and your background? Books don't spring fully formed from an author's head like Athena from the mind of Zeus. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about your background in design and in content management and content strategy, and really what inspired you to write this book. Why Trustworthy? Why now?
Sure. So my background is in design and content strategy. I studied design in school and then started asking questions probably that were more related to content, but I don't know that I knew to call it that. But I studied visual problem solving and how to meet the needs of different audiences through things like typeface selection and color and the density of information on the page. And then graduated college in kind of like the height of the dot-com boom and bust, and joined a content strategy team at a large consultancy and was there for a couple of years, then went in-house at a corporation up in New Hampshire for about a year. Was hired out of there into a couple of mid-sized agencies to help them start their content strategy teams, and then went out on my own in 2010 to focus more on brand-driven content strategy. So in other words, looking at how organizations can effectively meet the needs of their target audiences and identify what those needs are, while not losing themselves in the process, but having a clear understanding of their communication goals, their sort of message architecture or hierarchy of communication goals. So they would understand what made them unique, and then be able to offer distinct content in a distinct voice to meet the needs of their audience. And I think that that's so important, because as I was sort of coming up within the design profession, within the web industry, kind of in those early days of web design, there were a lot of changes going on, like around 2000, 2001. I think as anybody that worked on the web or used the web maybe remembers, there was a lot of brochureware where many organizations were taking what were essentially like their old brochures and saying, well, let's just put this up on our website. And that met certain needs, some needs of sharing information maybe about the organization, but not in a way that necessarily respected all the needs of their target audience and of their users.
Mhm.
And I think as in the profession, we started realizing, this is a problem. People's needs aren't always being met by either the kinds of information they need or the things that they want to do on a website, whether it's transactional and they're looking to maybe compare products and buy something, or they're looking to engage with government services in a way that makes sense to them and with kind of the terms that they would use. We weren't always meeting our users' needs. And that's sort of when we saw the rise of user-centered design, which kind of dragged the pendulum then to the other side to say, let's just focus on the needs of our users. I wanted to kind of bring things more to the middle to say, well, how do brands still maintain a distinct and unique voice within an industry, so that not all the companies that are serving maybe the needs of a customer, so that not all airlines sound exactly the same, that not all businesses within the same industry sound the same and look the same. They shouldn't. So that's where I focus on brand-driven content strategy, and that's what I focus on in my practice. And then over the past probably 5 years or so, I started noticing kind of a disturbing trend around marketing and content and content strategy, or how we determine the right content, the right text and photography and illustration that'll meet the needs of our audiences. And that was that a lot of marketing was falling flat. People were kind of coming at things with maybe more skepticism and cynicism that was really undermining sources of authority and expertise. And I think we saw that first happening in the political sphere, where people were listening to politicians and saying, well, they all lie to you, or looking at businesses and saying, well, everybody's out to make a buck. You can't trust anybody. And that problem that was happening probably even more so 5, 6 years ago, that's when I started seeing it happening. That paralleled then a shift where we were turning away from traditional sources of expertise, maybe like newscasters or even newspapers that you used to always trust. People were turning away from them and instead turning to their filter bubbles, kind of people just like them. And that happened a lot until we realized that a lot of those filter bubbles were being gamed. Companies were posting their own reviews, or there were algorithms that were serving us news to pay attention to. And when that happened, I think when people became more aware of those filter bubbles, but were still experiencing gaslighting and other things that were kind of feeding their cynicism, that's when people started to turn inward still further to say, well, if I can't trust the outside world, I'll just go with my gut. What feels right probably is what is right. And when that happens, when people kind of go with their gut instincts, but they've been experiencing so much gaslighting, they've sort of lost their gut instincts. And that's where we see how people have problems making decisions, and that sales cycles start to slow down. The economy slows down further. That's not just the fault of the pandemic.
Mhm.
And that's where I wanted to focus with Trustworthy, to say, well, if we are seeing these problems where people have lost trust in the world around them, where they're greeting most information with cynicism, not with curiosity,
Mhm.
what can we do about it? What can businesses do about it? And that's where I wanted to focus.
We hear a lot about news deserts where there's not a lot of access to information. We hear about health deserts where certain communities don't have access to reliable health care. We hear about food deserts where you can't find, good, fresh, nutritious food within walking distance or within an easy drive of your home. I would argue that a trust desert has also developed, where you look around at the sources where you used to know you could find reliable information and you don't believe them anymore. Some of that, I think I agree, is definitely those filter bubbles. But then what happens when you rely on your gut, but the subject is something like vaccines, where maybe you're not an expert? How do brands, or how do authority figures bridge that trust gap and fill that desert in that case?
That's a really good way to look at the problem, because I do think, like you made the comparison to like food deserts, where we don't have reliable sources of nutrition in all communities, and then people may end up turning to other sources, or kind of just filling up for that basic need of feeling full, kind of filling up on what we would call garbage or things that have lower nutritional value. I definitely think that happens with information too, where when we don't have reliable sources of information, or information sources that that can approach a problem in a more neutral way and present their evidence and let people make their own decisions, but instead are less valuable sources of information, then yeah, people end up filling up on that same kind of garbage. I think the way that we counter that is by empowering our audiences, by giving them information from multiple sources. And I think furthermore, people that are in positions of authority, like for example, in public health, when physicians can approach conversations with their patients, or holistic health practitioners, or anybody with whom you already have that kind of relationship, when they can approach those conversations less with an authoritarian kind of perspective of saying, here's what you must believe, this is the only way forward, only listen to me. That's the kind of tone that politicians that engage in gaslighting take with their audiences. It's not effective. But I think when people can approach those conversations, when sources of authority and expertise can approach those conversations by instead engaging first with the people that they want to affect, by relating to them on a more human level, and with a degree of compassion, maybe for their own confusion or misunderstanding, that's where we can start that conversation. And then by bringing into it multiple sources of information so that people can make better decisions, that's helpful. Then I think the other part of that is also bringing a degree of vulnerability into the conversation. I think there's nothing wrong with people in a position of expertise or people in a position of authority they don't need to always project bravado to achieve results, because I think we've been hearing a ton of false bravado. I think instead, for people to engage in those conversations by sharing in maybe their own sort of paths to making decisions, or sharing in the process of how their own knowledge has continued to evolve, that exposes more of the human side of making decisions. I think when physicians can say, and I just heard earlier today on Tiziana Deering's program on WBUR, she was interviewing a physician who said, I haven't always felt comfortable about the coronavirus vaccine. I was worried about side effects, but I continued to follow the studies on it. I've been watching to see, have there been a lot of side effects that people are reporting? I've been continuing to gather information, and now I feel comfortable with it, and I feel comfortable recommending it to my patients. I think sharing in that kind of sort of human evolution, the evolution of our understanding, that takes some vulnerability, but I think that's the way we learn to engage with people and then affect the beliefs of other people as well.
Do you think there's a generational gap in effect here? A generation ago, you didn't question your doctor when they told you to do something. You didn't ask them about a certain medication. You didn't ask them about your symptoms. Women were routinely diagnosed with hysteria when they were complaining about pain. People of color were completely disregarded when complaining about symptoms. A lot of the brands that are most well-known and most powerful today, and a lot of the politicians who are in positions of power today, come from that older generation where you didn't disagree, you did what you were told, you didn't question authority. How does that jibe with filling the trust desert? And how do you encourage brands to show vulnerability when the people running those brands were brought up to believe that vulnerability was the same as weakness?
Right, right. And the position that I take in Trustworthy is that vulnerability can be a strength. We can embrace kind of our own personal misgivings and then path to understanding to kind of bring a broader audience into maybe supporting our beliefs. I think going back to what you said, though, that maybe it's a generational thing, I think there is something to that. I think it's both generational and also cultural, because I've spoken to people that are 20, 30 years older than me that do sometimes approach those conversations by saying, well, the doctor says, so I'm not going to question that. I've also spoken to people in that age group, though, that have always believed that, all right, that what the doctor says, that's one thing, but I also need to do my own research. Hopefully they're doing that research on trustworthy websites and other platforms. And then I've spoken with physicians as well that sometimes will approach those engagements as a partnership, that they have a partnership with their patient to achieve good health outcomes. Other physicians, regardless of age, and this is where I think there's a cultural component in it, approach those kinds of conversations with their patients by first asking, well, wait, why are you doing that additional research? Don't be looking at WebMD or any place else. Just come to me.
Don't ask Dr. Google about that headache.
Exactly. Yeah. And certainly that way lies some trouble. But I think it's the difference between authoritative and authoritarian perspectives too, because I think when we hear that more authoritarian, don't ask any questions, just do as I say, when we hear that kind of mindset, especially as you said, coming from maybe politicians or authority figures that are oftentimes older, and they brush up against an audience that says, well, wait, I do have some questions. How do I know that this is right for me? We see how there can be a lot of friction there. And I think when there are brands that are just pushing out information and then don't know what to do when an audience responds negatively to them, or when they get pushback on Twitter or on social media or whatever, we see how they kind of crumble in the face of that friction. They crumble in the face of that pressure because they're not used to maybe answering questions around their perspectives. I find the brands that have the greatest success now in social media, in any kind of way in which their audience wants more engagement, are the brands that instead can embrace not an authoritarian perspective, but more of an authoritative perspective. In other words, they're comfortable in their leadership. They're able to offer the sort of wisdom that says, I'm here, you're not, let me tell you about it. And that's oftentimes, I think, how we can think about authority, being able to go where your audience cannot, either because if you're maybe a reporter, you can go to certain places, but they're dangerous, or your audience couldn't afford to go there. And you can kind of bring them there, offer your perspective so that they can understand more about that part of the world. That's authority. And I think in marketing departments too, there's a form of authority that comes from being able to say, I sit down the hall from the product development team. I can tell you what's coming down the pike, or I can make recommendations for you on maybe the particular phone or the particular kitchen tool that's going to be right for you. That's a form of authority that is open to discussion, open to that kind of back and forth that acknowledges that I'm not the sole source of expertise. My audience knows a thing or two as well. And a lot of the brands that I bring into Trustworthy are comfortable with that kind of expertise and authority. And I think that's where we see real opportunities.
You mentioned a situation where you said you hoped that the person was doing their research and getting information from trustworthy sources. We have a great question from an audience member that really has to do with that. And he asks, how would you best distinguish between cynicism versus reading with a critical eye? What's the difference between being cynical, not trusting what you find, and being really critical and evaluating all the sources and all the information you get?
Yeah, I think it's almost the difference, if I could paraphrase, kind of the difference between cynicism and skepticism, of not believing everything that you hear, but being open to the discovery process. Whereas I think cynicism says, I don't believe anything, and I'm going to put up that wall and then just kind of move on from there. And I would say the difference between them, I think it's almost kind of in the core of that question, the difference between cynicism and not believing everything that you read. Maybe the difference is in reading or being able to say, I'm open to taking in new information. I think some of the difference also comes from the confidence of the individual, of being willing to say, all right, I know that I know where to look for more information. I can continue to gather information on this topic before I maybe make a purchase decision or decide if it's going to feel safe for me to go into that restaurant, or if I'm going to feel maybe safe going inside that shop that now is allowing in people, how crowded is it in there? What's their mask policy? All of those types of things. I think as we look at issues of public health now, or as we just look at really basic common issues around e-commerce and shopping and those sort of transactions, a lot of that comes down to what sort of comfort level do you have? How confident do you feel about your ability to make good decisions when you take in new information? And I think it's that confidence of being willing to continue the research, to take in new information, to know that you can evaluate it. That allows for, I think, a healthy sort of skepticism. Whereas lacking that confidence of saying, well, they're all out to get you, you can't trust anybody, that's cynicism.
How do you know that a brand is worthy of your trust? I mean, there are ways you can present information that nurture trust. There are ways that you can present research that seems authoritative rather than authoritarian. But at the core, how do you know whether something's trustworthy?
For me, I look for kind of outside perspective. Is it an organization that's willing to submit themselves to maybe outside inspection or outside monitoring? Do they have different seals of approval on their site that sort of have that halo of trust? Do I trust the organization that is keeping an eye on them? And I think we can see that when we look for board certification from our doctors, when we look for maybe the J.D. Power seal of approval on a car manufacturer. Has a book gotten like a certain seal of approval? Did it win a certain honor or medal, that type of thing? So we can look for those sort of signifiers of trust. Beyond that, I also look at the tone in which they present information. Are they speaking down to me? Do I feel like there's this degree of condescension? Are they couching everything in the third person in a way that just feels like there's no entry points for me? Are there ways for me to ask questions? Because I feel like that level of, you could say, vulnerability or risk of saying, okay, come in, ask us questions, engage in the live chat. We've empowered the people that are maybe the live chat operators or our customer service operators to answer your questions. That to me offers a degree of trust.
Sometimes the sheer amount of information we face every day can be really, really overwhelming. Back in the day, like when I was a kid, I got into this conversation with my kids the other day. We were watching The Muppet Show at my insistence. And my 14-year-old was like, how did you watch this stuff? And I said, it was what was on.
With glee, that is how you watched it.
And my 16-year-old said, well, why didn't you change the channel? And I said, there were only 4 channels. And that's really what it was. There were 4 channels. You watched the news when it was on at 6, and if you stayed up late, you watched it again at 11. You got the newspaper in the morning, and you listened to a radio show maybe while your mom was driving you to school, maybe. You didn't have smartphones with push alerts. You didn't have email with newsletters. You didn't have smart watches where you'd see a crawl. And even during the news, there weren't the little, the bottom third of the screen wasn't full of graphics and explanations. So when you're overwhelmed with information, what role does design play in imbuing a brand with trust?
I think design can, let me rephrase that. Design should triage the world for us. And I think that applies whether you're interacting with a single product and trying to understand how to use it, or approaching maybe a really complex interface and again trying to understand how to use it and where to look first, or just sitting down in front of your computer and where maybe you've got multiple tabs open and you've got pop-ups and different alerts going on. You've got to decide how to focus your attention. The job of design is to say, look here first. This is what you need to do whatever it is you're trying to accomplish. And I think once we break that down to look at maybe individual brands, individual organizations, that idea of triaging the world, of saying, look here first, this is what you need, and then maybe this is what else you need, and then this is what you want. That's the primary service of design.
So can any brand have a good design or a bad design? You're not just talking about doctors and politicians and big names like Coca-Cola. Can a person have a brand that could benefit from design? How do you enhance trustworthiness when you're not a major player in the business world?
Well, I think even outside of the major players, if we just talk in terms of small business, I think about the different websites that I interact with to decide, all right, should I go there? Does it feel safe to go there? Or do I just want to interact with them right now just online? Okay, how do I interact with them? What's the best way to do it? Do I need to leave this site and instead just pick up the phone? Or should I, or do I prefer to do that? I think those are all kind of the relevant opportunities for design right now. And I think if you're a small business owner, looking at how you engage the world through something like your website, that's the first way that you can help your audience make better decisions about how they interact with you, and as well as gain more confidence about you and what you offer, and maybe your attention to detail around things like safety right now, or your product array. But also that's what helps them build confidence in themselves, that they feel like, okay, going here will be safe, or this will be a good decision, or if I stop in there, I know I'm going to be able to find what I need, or I can call them up and I know they're going to be able to recommend a good product for me. I think all of that can come through in design. And when we look at different cues in maybe the context of a website, like the level of detail that it offers. Is a website giving me long blocks of information, long paragraphs and bulleted lists that I've got to kind of sift through? Or do they help me figure out, all right, this is the specific page I need, and then I just need to focus my attention here? Those are the ways that a designer can consider the needs of their audience, the needs of the brand that they're representing, as well as then how to just make everyone feel good and more confident about the experience.
When it comes to trust and trustworthiness, we hear a lot about how the government should do more to gain people's trust. We hear a lot about how the education system needs to do more to mitigate ignorance, to teach people about civics when it comes to government, about history when it comes to how the US got to where it is now. Do you think businesses have a role to play in rebuilding trust in society?
Definitely. And I think now is the perfect time for businesses to step into that role, to seize that responsibility. Ethan Zuckerman, in his new book, Mistrust, recently came out in January, and he talks about how we've lost trust in so many large civic institutions and government and kind of federal government and whatnot, and what consumers can do to kind of respond in that space. I'm curious about what businesses can do, because I think whether you run a small business or a civic organization or a nonprofit, kind of any sort of organizational entity, there's an opportunity to step into that space and look at how you can rebuild trust by first rebuilding the confidence of your audience, by empowering them. And I think for any organization, you can adopt an approach of saying, not only am I going to meet the needs of my audience, but I'm going to empower them with information so that they feel like they can make good decisions, and also to feel good about the decisions they make. So for example, one of the organizations that I interviewed for Trustworthy is Crutchfield Electronics. And the Crutchfield is it's a good-sized organization that sells everything from camera equipment and home audio equipment to maybe things that you would put in your car to enhance the audio system and that. And they offer a lot of information through their website. Really, really long pages filled with details, lots of different what we call content types, whether you're more of a visual learner or a verbal learner, or maybe you're somebody that just wants to see how do you fit a stereo system into a Chevy Silverado. You can look up information like that. And the site is packed with information. And what they've seen from their own user research is that people spend a lot of time on those really long pages. When people get to the end of one of those long pages, they click to keep reading more. These are people in their audience that love to do research. And then when they finally get around to making a purchase on the site, and it might be over time, might take a few days or even a few weeks, when they finally get around to making a purchase, the rate of returns is really low. People don't tend to buy from them and then get the thing and then say, not quite right, I'm going to send it back. They might offer free shipping both ways anyhow, but people don't do that because they feel confident when they finally make a purchase decision. They feel good while they're waiting for it to arrive. And they've been able to measure this, as I said, through user research and site analytics and focus groups with their users, as well as by talking with the folks that are handling customer support on the phone to kind of track those discussions as well. And I think part of the role of business there is empowering the audience with enough information so that you can go to their website and maybe you don't really know much about cameras. Maybe you want to buy your first single lens reflex camera. And you're like, I don't know much about this. Teach me about lenses. Let me feel like I know a thing or two. By the time you finally get around to buying, maybe it's your first camera, you can feel confident about it. You can feel like you've become a smarter person. And I think that's something then that people can take into other areas of their lives as well. Once you can kind of gain that confidence, that's something that translates to other arenas, and businesses can do that.
But not every consumer is interested in reams and reams and reams and reams of content, right? So one thing I really enjoyed about your book is that it's not really a how-to manual. Do these things to gain trust. It's really more of a series of very engaging, very in-depth case studies where you're looking at different types of businesses and talking about what worked for them and how they overcame certain problems. Can you give us another example, maybe from your book, of a business that learned enough about their audience that they knew they didn't need to have tons and tons of in-depth information right there in the open for every single page that the audience member clicked on?
Well, and this is, I guess, another example of design's responsibility to triage the world, to say you don't need everything all at once. It's not a business, but the British government, gov.uk, so the primary website by which British citizens get information about interacting with the government or accessing government services, they went through that. They had that kind of similar challenge of paring back information for their audience. It used to be that if you needed information about maybe how to pay a tax or access a government benefit, there were 9 different websites that in the federal government there that you could turn to. There was so much information there that frequently people would instead turn to the Guardian newspaper to say, well, what's kind of the appropriate way to handle this issue?
Part
or
of
how
me
are
like,
other people?
yes, of course they turn to the media.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Biased.
Gatekeeper of government there. But they shouldn't have been. They should have been able to get information about government services from the government. Problem was, with those 9 different websites, Of course, there wasn't consistent information among them. And it was something like 75,000 pages of content that the British government web team had to maintain. So they took the approach of saying, let's not publish all this information. Like, for example, if you were interested in bringing bees into Britain as a beekeeper, you could get information from the government about which bee species would do well in different parts of the country, how to build a beehive, maybe how to source your bees, all great stuff that should really come from an agricultural organization, not from the government. You should just get information about paying taxes on importing bees from the government. So they took the approach, they adopted the mantra of let's just publish content on only the things that only we can publish content. Let's leave the other stuff for other people. And in adopting that kind of belief, that sort of creative direction, they were able to pare down their content from 75,000 pages to 3,000 pages.
Wow.
One website, a lot easier to focus. And then they cleaned up the content that they were offering. They edited it down so that pages about specific services were limited, much more constrained. You could find out, all right, everything that you needed on a single page without other indicators, without other references saying, now go here for more on this or go here for more on this. They allowed people to focus when they got to those pages. Their user testing revealed that people were pleasantly surprised, sometimes kind of wondered like, oh, is that all there is? That's all I need to do? That's great. And I think that level of surprise was a good indicator that people could get just enough information and they didn't need more.
Which brings me to another question from our audience. She asks, how do you think building brand trust post-pandemic will differ from pre-pandemic? How will brands have to address the psychological and economic impact of a pandemic? And what strategies will they have to use to gain consumer confidence?
That is a great question. There's a lot of good questions within that. I think the first part of that, like what is going to change, I think it's the level of detail that people expect from the organizations around them. I think just on things like going into a restaurant, it used to be that a lot of restaurants were able to get away with maybe just having a page that listed their hours, maybe some highlights from their menu. I think we've seen over the past few years where more restaurants will include maybe the entire menu. But now people expect so much more. I think we're going to be looking for images that show, like, what does safety look like in your restaurant? How crowded is it? What sort of precautions do you take? Like, let's see a picture from back of the house. Let's see a picture in the kitchen. Are people spaced apart in there if that's appropriate for them? So I think people will be looking for more of that level of detail, and including on things like, show me, do you have a lot of gluten going on? And how are you serving different allergy needs? I think we expect a greater level of detail and more information because we've come to learn that information is what allows us to make good decisions around our own personal safety and security. And when we can kind of take care of those concerns, then we can set them aside and say, okay, now I don't have to worry so much. I've figured out what I need to know. Now I can move through the world in a better and maybe more confident and happier way. And I think we're going to continue to expect that level of detail and information from the organizations around us. And I think that also, going back to the earlier point around authoritative versus authoritarian organizations and leadership styles, I think that represents a further shift from those more authoritative organizations that could have previously basically said, trust me, it'll be fine, to now more authoritarian organizations, or sorry, yeah, I think I'm getting those mixed up, but now to the shift to more organizations that are able to say, here's what we recommend, here's what you can see about us, here's who we are and how we are. Okay, now you can make better decisions about how you spend your time, if you want to spend your money here. And I think we see something similar happening kind of in discussions around different social issues too, where again, people expect to know more about the organizations around them, about the brands where they choose to spend their time and spend their money. More and more people like to vote with their dollars. And I think some of that is a reflection of seeing like the impact of Citizens United, where we do have more corporate money in politics now. But I think it was the last Edelman Trust survey looked at how something like 60% or 65% of US consumers said that they want to know more about the social values of the brands that they support. So I think with that mindset, yeah, more people want to know, like, if their values align with the values of the organizations where they're spending their money. People want that level of insight.
It sounds a bit like you're saying that given the economic impact of the pandemic, um, we're not seeing as much aspirational marketing and aspirational content. There's not so much about let's vacation in the south of France this year because we have nothing better to do. It's a planned purchase that's done over time that's really special. And it sounds to me that you're saying that a lot of companies will need to give consumers even more reasons to go with them and to make that purchase, kind of a way to acknowledge that the economy has changed because of the pandemic.
Yeah, I think there is that element that I don't know that we will see less aspirational marketing, though, because I think there are still a lot of companies that haven't gotten that yet.
Mhm.
But I think that we should. I think smart organizations are moving away from that and instead selling on how they can partner with people
Mhm.
rather than just pushing visuals at them and saying, isn't this the life that you want?
Mhm.
Instead, they're offering more ways to be kind of accessible to the people that they want in their audience and their potential customers.
So we've talked about giving more information. We've talked about curating the information so that the consumer is getting the information they really need and the information they really want. What about disinformation? Aren't there actors out there who are using these same kind of methods to push conspiracies, to push beyond politics, or to push just disinformation? And how does that affect the trust deserts that have grown out there?
Well, I think when we talk about disinformation, if we take a look like at QAnon and how that has been able to thrive, how so many cults have continued to thrive over the past several years, I think it's because in some ways they're very effective at meeting their audiences where they are. And that's certainly something that I recommend. How can you meet your audience where they are and speak to them in their language, use their jargon to build rapport? I think the problem arises, though, when they do engage in gaslighting, when they say, only look here, don't look to any other sources of information. You don't know what you're doing when you look to those other sources of information. We're your one source of truth. I think when you have media outlets that speak to their audiences that way, that maybe kind of push them into submitting to that mindset and give them that sense of comfort that they don't need to look elsewhere, it appeals to their fears. It appeals to their concerns.
Mhm.
I think instead we can appeal to not people's fear, but to their hope,
Mhm.
because we all believe that we can be smarter, that we all think that we can learn a little bit more, keep scrolling, read one more article, click through one more photo gallery, and be able to navigate the world so much better. I
Mhm.
think we all engage the world with that level of hope. And I think that we can appeal to that instead, not by going down the path of disinformation and saying, don't look elsewhere, we're your own source of truth, but rather by saying, all right, let's convene the conversation. Maybe let's bring our competitors into a conversation to give you better information. And we see different examples of that. I think even to look like at BuzzFeed,
Mhm.
they've started a feature they started a few years ago within some of their articles where it would end with this box that said outside your bubble, where if they had an article on a particular topic, then they would curate content, maybe links from how that topic was being discussed on Reddit, what people were saying about it on Twitter, some other articles on the same topic that came from outside of their website. That comes from a position of confidence. And I think that's the type of approach that appeals to people's hope, that says, all right, you want to get smarter? Let's give you some good information where you can get smarter. And it also speaks from a point of confidence, of saying that we're comfortable with our knowledge, comfortable enough to not tell you can't look elsewhere. We know you're going to do that. Instead, we want you to feel confident that you're savvy about this topic too. Let's get there together.
So what would you say about companies that have eroded trust? attendee asks, any thought on how to persuade a team that's focused on improving the company's bottom line in the short term and not making decisions, and how to help them avoid continuously making decisions that may erode customer trust in the long term? Where's that fine line between staying profitable and, I guess, being mercenary in some ways, where the trust matters less than how much money you're raking in?
Yeah, I mean, that's tough, especially when you can see immediate benefits to decisions that, as you said, may erode long-term trust. I think that with any discussions around content and design, I've always found that the best way to have that discussion with people kind of outside of maybe the creative department or outside of the marketing team is by looking back at the money, by demonstrating that, yeah, we may lose or we may gain money in the short term, but we are eroding our entire customer base. And I think we can look to some really strong examples of that. For example, Penzeys Spices, big spice retailer based in the Midwest. About 5 years ago now, when Trump was rising in power, they took to Facebook, their CEO, Bill Penzey, took to Facebook with a really long post about the company's politics. And he said, what we're seeing from the new administration about immigration and hatred of immigrants, those aren't our politics. And yes, we're a spice company, but before you say, hey, stay in your lane there, cinnamon boy, know that this is our lane, that politics and when we look at topics around immigration, that's the story of cooking in America. So many of our recipes come here. So many of our family favorites come here on the backs of immigrants. This is our lane. And he took to Facebook with that kind of message. And that's kind of an example of losing some money in the short term because people were outraged. There were a ton of headlines around that. They lost a lot of customers.
And even his sister capitalized on that. His sister and
Right.
brother-in-law own what seems to be a competitor, but once you know the family relationship, that's maybe not so much of a competitor.
Yeah.
And they were saying, we won't talk about politics, buy your spices from us.
Yeah. The Spice House, their competitor in Milwaukee, said, yeah, we don't think business should be in politics. So here's a coupon code, no politics. Come in with that and we'll give you a discount. And it seemed like, oh, maybe that is the right approach in the short term. But something interesting happened. Penzeys lost a lot or a number of their existing customers, but they enormously expanded their customer base because suddenly they were attracting interest from people who maybe weren't big home cooks, but they felt like, oh, well, I like these politics. This organization's values align with my values. I'm going to buy spices as a Christmas present for people in my family that do cook. The same thing happened where they would maybe lose a few customers, but then gain so many more. Every time he took to Facebook with that kind of post, that sort of message, their sales were up 50% year over year. They've continued to do really, really well. So those short-term decisions that maybe can erode confidence, they don't really have long-term benefits. I think Penzeys gives us an example of how those short-term decisions can actually help to shift the confidence in an organization and then gather a different audience as well.
How do you stop that, though, from seeming opportunistic or superficial? We have a question from the audience also, and I know we're running close to the end of our time, but I think we have enough time to squeeze this one in. Her question is, in response to the uprising last year in the wake of George Floyd's murder, a lot of companies were grappling with how to express their stance on anti-racism and on diversity and on inclusion. And in some cases, the messaging seemed opportunistic and superficial. What would you say about how companies can effectively handle commenting on major political events? Now, in that particular case, it's different from Penzeys because Penzeys took a stance and said, this is what our company stands for. They kind of put their money and their marketing where their mouths were. What about when you're talking about a company expressing an opinion or expressing solidarity or expressing disapproval in the moment, in the news moment? How does that help build trust, or how does it inadvertently erode trust?
I think that the way it builds or erodes trust comes down to the long-term commitment, how we get beyond the superficial. Because you're right, I think in the context of Black Lives Matter, in the context of Me Too, a lot of organizations realize that, okay, my audience cares about this. We should care about this too. And I think that's a good place to start for many organizations.
Mhm.
I think though, what many experienced in kind of wading into that and hopefully doing more than just a single advertisement or a new campaign, they realized, wait a sec, do we know anything about this? What are we doing? How do we care about this? I mean, for example, in the context of Me Too, I think some organizations that expressed their support for women then got a lot of backlash from female employees saying, well, wait, you don't support this though internally. Look at how we've been kind of raising flags around these different people or these different issues. What are you going to do about it? And I think that was a tough conversation in many organizations, in many HR departments, as well as with Black Lives Matter, where they were expressing support only to hear from their own Black employees, wait, how do you support us? What are you doing to increase diversity and improve inclusion in the organization and bring more people into the hiring funnel?
Mhm.
I think hearing those internal complaints is not a reason, though, that organizations shouldn't wade into this space. I
Mhm.
think that you can work for external change in society, even as you're realizing the need for internal change in your own organization. In fact, I think it's really an opportunity for organizations to kind of build trust then, both internally and externally, to be able to expand that conversation to say, this is something we support, but we realize we haven't always done a great job here. So here's what we're doing to improve that. That's a wonderful point of vulnerability as a strength. And I think we're hearing that from more and more organizations that realize that, yeah, they have things that they need to fix as well. So let's fix those things out in the open. I think when companies are able to acknowledge a problem, apologize, and then say, here's what we're going to do about it. Here's how you can hold us accountable. That's a wonderful thing. That's a wonderful opportunity because they will improve. Their audience will see how they're improving. And you can maybe call it virtue signaling. I think people complain about that when they do see companies signaling their values. There's an awful lot of vice signaling as well. So you can call it virtue signaling, but I think when companies do wade into that space and say, here's what we stand for. Okay, now we realize we have our own problems and we need to improve too. They act as a beacon to other organizations to say, you should support this issue too, even if it means you have to do your own work at the same time. That's not a bad thing. That's how we all improve together.
It sounds to me that a lot of it comes down to seeming versus being. It's not enough to seem vulnerable. You actually have to be vulnerable. It's not enough to seem authentic. You really have to be authentic, acknowledging your own flaws and kind of committing to work on them. If your customers give you a chance, prompts them to give you that chance in a lot of ways.
And I think that gap between seeing and being, we can define that as authenticity. I mean, that's a term that we fling around a lot in a lot of companies and a lot of marketing departments. Everybody wants to be authentic or transparent. We always have to ask, well, authentic to what? Do you know what you stand for? And if you want to be transparent, well, what do people see about you? And I think we have a call for greater authenticity and greater transparency in so many businesses and so many civic organizations, in our government. That's not a bad thing, but it means that we need to kind of clean house a little bit too, clean up what's going on, clarify our values so that when people see them, when they see them in action, when we make our values visible, they like what they see.
Well, I think we've reached the end of our time. So any last thoughts you want to share? A quick reminder of where they can pick up your book and whether they can get one of those precious signed copies that I've heard are out there somewhere?
Yes, they are. Yeah, you can get those precious signed copies at the Silver Unicorn in Acton or at the Silver Unicorn online, because I think you guys have a good shipping budget, so let's get them everywhere.
Yes, silverunicornbooks.com. Yes, very important. Yes.
Where can people go if they want to find out more about you?
You can visit me online at appropriateinc.com, learn more about the book at appropriateinc.com/trustworthy, and find me on Twitter at mbloomstein.
Great. And that's Inc., even though it sounds like INK, that's Inc., like incorporated, INC.
Exactly. Yeah. Because it's a double entendre. Why would you not go for that when you can?
I like words. I like plays on words. That sounds good to me. Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me here for this discussion. I learned a lot. It was really interesting.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the Silver Unicorn.
Yes. Thank you so much. This has been, I mean, just such a deep and rich discussion. This has been fabulous. Thank you. Thank you to you both. And happy launch, Margot. This has just been so amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. And thanks to everybody that attended and asked such good questions. I appreciate it.
Indeed. No.
All right. Great.
All right, so see you soon, and please pick up this book. And if you are not local, then do be sure to pick up this book at an independent bookstore near you. Everybody, have a great evening. We'll see you again soon. Bye, y'all. Stay safe.